The bride's scream echoed through the marble corridors of the villa, but no one came to help her. They never did. This was tradition, after all, and in ancient Rome, tradition was more sacred than the gods themselves. They called it as prime noctis in hushed whispers behind closed doors, though the official records would never acknowledge its existence. The right of the first night. The right of the master to claim what was never his to take. It was a ritual so dark, so fundamentally cruel, that even an empire built on conquest and blood would eventually try to erase it from history. But on that particular night in 73 AD, in a villa overlooking the Tiber River, one man would make a choice that would change everything. Marcus Aurelius Silvanus was not the emperor, though he shared a name with one who would come later. He was a decorated centurion, a man who had brought glory to Rome on battlefields from Britannia to Judea. His weathered face bore the scars of 20 campaigns, and his eyes held the weariness of someone who had seen too much death. At 43, he had finally earned enough coin and status to retire from military service and claim a villa with lands worked by a dozen slaves. Among those slaves was Althea, a Greek woman of 22 whose parents had been taken during a raid on a coastal village when she was barely 5 years old. She had grown up knowing nothing but servitude, yet somehow, impossibly, she had retained a spark of something the empire couldn't crush: hope, kindness, a stubborn belief that people could be more than what Rome made them. She was to be married that night to Damon, another Greek slave who worked Marcus's fields. It should have been a moment of joy, one of the few genuine celebrations allowed to people who owned nothing, not even themselves. They had saved for 2 years to buy the wine and bread for a modest feast. Marcus had even given permission for the ceremony, a gesture Althea had thought generous at the time. She didn't know about the ritual. Neither did Damon. The wedding ceremony took place in the slave quarters as the sun set, painting the Roman sky in shades of crimson and gold. Althea wore a simple tunic of undyed linen, but Damon looked at her as though she were draped in imperial purple. They exchanged vows in Greek, words their ancestors had spoken for generations, binding themselves to each other in the only way slaves could claim autonomy over their own lives. The celebration lasted barely an hour before Cassius, Marcus's steward, appeared at the entrance to the quarters. He was a freedman, someone who had once been a slave himself but now enforced the master's will with the zealousness of a convert. His face was impassive as he announced that the master required Althea's presence in the main villa. Damon's face went pale. He knew immediately what this meant, even if Althea didn't yet. He had heard the stories from older slaves, whispered warnings about what happened to married slave women on their wedding nights. He stepped forward, placing himself between his wife and the steward. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Not this, anything but this." Cassius struck him across the face with the back of his hand. "You forget your place." Althea still didn't understand, not until she was led through the torch-lit corridors of the villa, past frescoes depicting Rome's military conquests, past statues of gods who seemed to avert their marble eyes. She was brought to the master's chamber, where Marcus sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the darkening river. When she finally understood why she had been summoned, her scream shattered the night's silence. But here is where the story takes its turn, where one man's crisis of conscience would echo through the centuries that followed. Marcus had been sitting in that chair for 2 hours, a cup of wine growing warm in his hand. He had dismissed his body slaves and ordered that he not be disturbed. He was thinking about another night, 20 years earlier, in a village in Gaul. He had been a young soldier then, fresh from his first real battle, still drunk on the violence and power that came with wearing the armor of Rome. His century had raided a village, and he had participated in acts that he had never allowed himself to fully remember, burying the memories beneath layers of duty and honor and service to the empire. But lately, those memories had been surfacing. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the proximity to death after so many years of war. Or perhaps it was simply that the human soul, no matter how hardened, eventually demands an accounting. When Cassius brought Althea to his chamber and she screamed, something inside Marcus shattered. He stood abruptly, causing Cassius to step back in surprise. "Leave us," Marcus commanded. "But master," The ritual I said leave. When they were alone, Althea pressed herself against the far wall, trembling. She had heard stories of what Roman masters did to defiant slaves. Crucifixion, being thrown to wild beasts, fates worse than death. Marcus remained by the window, his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I brought you here because it is expected. Because this is what men in my position do. Because this is Rome. He paused, his shoulders sagging. But I cannot do it. I will not do it. Althea said nothing, not daring to believe what she was hearing. Marcus turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen in a Roman master before: shame. 20 years ago, I was part of something terrible. I told myself it was war, that it was necessary, that it was Rome's right as conqueror. But it was none of those things. It was just cruelty masquerading as tradition. He gestured to the door. This is the same thing. And I am tired of being cruel. He walked to a chest in the corner and removed a leather pouch heavy with coins. You will return to your quarters. Tomorrow, I will draw up manumission papers for you and your husband. You will be free. This money will allow you to travel, to start a life somewhere beyond Rome's reach. Althea's legs nearly gave out. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this? Marcus was silent for a long moment. Because someone should have stopped me 20 years ago. Because tradition is not the same as righteousness. Because I have spent 2 decades serving an empire that confuses power with virtue. He met her eyes. And because you smiled at a child yesterday. Althea blinked in confusion. I saw you in the garden. Marcus continued. My grandnephew was visiting. He fell and scraped his knee, and you stopped your work to comfort him. You spoke to him gently, cleaned his wound, told him a story until he stopped crying. You had every reason to resent that child, to see him as your oppressor's blood. But you showed him kindness anyway. His voice broke slightly. You reminded me that humanity is a choice we make, not something we're born into. And I am tired of choosing cruelty. The next morning, the household was in turmoil. Rumors spread like wildfire through the slave quarters and into the villa itself. The master had freed 2 slaves without cause. He had rejected a sacred tradition. He had shown weakness. Cassius was furious, arguing that such unprecedented mercy would undermine the entire social order. The other slaves will expect the same treatment, he warned. They will become ungovernable. Marcus met his steward's anger with calm resolve. Then let them expect it. Let them hope. Let them remember that they are human beings worthy of dignity. He paused. You were once a slave, Cassius. Have you forgotten what that felt like? Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. News of Marcus's actions spread beyond his household, whispered among the slave communities of Rome. Some saw it as an aberration, a moment of madness that would surely be corrected. But others saw it differently. They saw it as proof that change was possible, that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged by individual acts of conscience. 3 other families in Marcus's district quietly freed married slaves in the months that followed. None could afford the social cost of openly citing Marcus as inspiration, but the effect was unmistakable. The ritual, which had been practiced in shadows and denied in daylight, was slowly being strangled by the light of human decency. Althea and Damon used the money Marcus gave them to travel to Greece, to the region where Althea's parents had been taken all those years ago. They never forgot the Roman centurion who chose compassion over tradition, humanity over empire. Marcus lived another 12 years. He never married, never had children of his own. But he continued to free slaves, to speak quietly against the cruelties that Rome normalized. He faced social ostracism from some quarters, earned quiet respect from others. When he died, he was buried with military honors, but his greatest legacy was never recorded in official histories. The ritual he refused to perform that night didn't end immediately. Rome was too vast, too entrenched in its ways for one man's conscience to transform everything. But seeds of change, once planted, have a way of growing in unexpected places. The story of Marcus and Althea was passed down through generations, mostly among the descendants of slaves, but occasionally finding its way into the consciousness of others who needed to believe that goodness was possible even in systems designed to crush it. Eventually, Rome did want the world to forget the horrifying wedding night ritual. As the empire evolved, as Christianity spread, as social mores shifted, the practice became an embarrassment, something that contradicted the civilized image Rome wanted to project. The records were altered, the histories rewritten. The ritual was erased from official memory. But the story of the man who refused survived. It survived because it mattered, because in a world that often feels dominated by cruelty and power, we desperately need to believe that individual choices can make a difference. That one person's refusal to participate in evil can plant seeds that eventually grow into forests of change. The bride's scream that echoed through the marble corridors that night in 73 AD was not followed by the silence of acceptance. It was answered by something Rome never expected. A man who chose to be human rather than Roman, who chose compassion over tradition, who chose the dignity of a slave woman he barely knew over the approval of an empire. That choice mattered. It still matters, because we all face our own moments when tradition, power, or convenience whispers that cruelty is acceptable, that other people's pain is the price of our comfort. And in those moments, we have to decide what kind of people we want to be. Marcus chose kindness. One man, one night, one choice that rippled through history long after the empire that demanded cruelty had crumbled into dust.